going to start out, it's just a lot of vocabulary, but we're going to talk about sampling, like how do you set up the group that you're going to get data from, and then study how do you actually take those people and work with them to collect data. So just in general, population is every member of a set, every single member of a set. And the sample then is going to be a part of the population. So, like if I'm going to collect data, and maybe my population, I want to ask like everybody in the high school that goes here a question. That would be the whole population, would be the entire student body. But then a sample maybe could be this class. This could be a sample. All right. Now, whether that's a good sample or not, we're going to talk about that today. But just trying to disseminate what that is. So population is the whole group. A sample is part of that group. Now, you can actually get really good statistical information about a population, which is this first lovely blank, by studying just a sample of that population. Now, there are 4 different ways that we can kind of collect a sample. So I'm just going to give you a little definition, and then I put an actual example that would relate to that to the side. And then we're just going to discuss real quick whether or not we think that that would be a good way to sample people to get our data. All right, so convenience is the first one. And basically here is you select members based on convenience. So like, what would be really easy, an easy way, like this would be, this would be like easy for me to do. So like my little example to the side, I'm not making like a huge effort to do this. I'm just kind of in this, a really good one would be the example I have here. If you want to ask everybody in the school a question, or you want to find a sample here, what you would do is just ask your class. It's super easy for me to just ask you guys a question. I don't have to walk around anywhere. I don't have to go down to different parts of the building. I don't have to go upstairs. It's convenient. If I wanted to ask for a survey for the whole school, but I wanted to do a sample, it's just this class, it's easy for me to do. So it's like basically who's near you and what would be easy to just do really quickly. So it's a convenient sample. Okay, so if and I know this is 3rd period and it says 4th period on my lovely example there, but would this be a good way to collect data? Like if I just ask all you guys a question and I said that that was going to represent the whole school? Okay, in general, you can argue both ways for this, and I'm not saying totally throw out this data, but in general, I would say this is not the greatest way to get a sample. What would maybe be a reason why it wouldn't be good? If I ask all you guys a question, what would maybe be a reason that's not great to represent the whole school? This is obviously small. You guys are obviously all in an honors class, so that's not representing the entire student body. Grade level, I don't have any seniors in here. So there's just different reasons you could argue. But again, it's just kind of your opinion. I'm not saying that if I were to collect data, it would be totally invalid, but it's not the greatest way to get together my sample. Okay, now the second one is called self-selected. Basically here, you're going to select members based on volunteers. Select members based on volunteers. So basically, if you participate in this sample, you're selecting yourself. So in some way, you're maybe going to be asked something and you choose to respond or you choose to volunteer. So the little example I just put to the side It says to determine how many text messages high school students send in a week, researchers post a survey on a website and receive 750 responses. So the responses is the person choosing to respond to that survey question. So that's how it's self-selected, because you're making the effort to respond to the question. You're volunteering yourself to participate. Do you think this one would be a decent way to get a sample? This one, I think it just depends. They got to give me some more information, but this one can be pretty decent. You could maybe argue, if you're self-selecting, that maybe you're really passionate one way or another about whatever is being asked of you, or you're volunteering for something, or some people are more likely to volunteer for things than others, something like that. So you might say that it's not representing everybody, but in general, I feel like you could argue either way on that one. All right, now the last two are a little bit more not necessarily easy or volunteers. So we have what's called a systematic, and this is to select members at regular intervals. You're going to select members at regular intervals. So you're going to see some kind of a number in this sample selection here. So my example just says, you want to know what % of students here like Pepsi or Coke? You complete, or you get a list of like everybody in the building from the guidance office or whatever, and then it says you select every 15th student and ask them which one they prefer. So it doesn't have to be 15, it could be any number, but you select people at regular intervals. So if you see something like, well, we ask every 5th person, or we, in this case, you select every 15th or every 10th. It's at regular intervals you are asking people. Do you think this is like decent? Or this one, I would say in general, this one tends to be more of a good way to do your sample. You could argue for bad for this as well. It just depends. More information is needed, but this could be a pretty good way to collect data. This is usually pretty reliable. And then the last one is just what we call a random sample. Now, in some way, you have to order your population. The most typical way to do that is to assign everybody in the population a number. And then you randomly select based on the order that you put them in. So if I give everybody a number, and then I say, okay, I use a random number generator to randomly select, 50 people out of my population, that's a random sample. But everybody has to be assigned a number or a letter or something, and then you pick those numbers or letters at random and interact with those people. So this is to determine the percentage of voters in the district who favor a tax to pay for a school construction project. Researchers assign every voter a unique number, 1 to n. N would represent like the total number of people in the district, so that would change depending on where you're at. And then it says researchers use a random number generator or maybe a computer program or something like that to generate 30 unique values, 1 to n, and survey the voters whose names are associated with that. So it's everyone. The other thing here, everyone in the population is equally likely to be chosen here. Now, in general, if you can do this, the random sample tends to be the best. It tends to be good. But again, there's different scenarios where you might read the situation and go, I don't know about this. So it just depends, but most of the time this is a really good way to get your sample going for your data. All right, now, samples vary in how well they reflect a population. And a sample has what we call, this is that first blank, a bias, when part of the population is either overrepresented or underrepresented. Okay, now just the bottom part here is just a little definition for a bias. So a bias is some kind of systematic error that is introduced in your sampling method. Like I was telling you guys a few minutes ago, like if I ask you guys, just this class, a question, that doesn't represent the whole school because I'm maybe over-representing a certain age group, or I'm over-representing people that are taking honors classes or something like that. So that would be a good way to decide whether it's biased or not. Just kind of think through what is going on. Okay, now, we should all have the same answer for our method for each of these scenarios. But then, like I said, a lot of this is your opinion. If you can defend it, I will take it. And there's different ways I could argue this is biased or this is not. If you think that the method is biased, then I just want you to say why. You don't have to write me a novel or anything. Just like a couple little bullet points, like why do you think this is biased? If you don't think it's biased and you think this would be a good way to get a sample, then you don't have to write anything. Okay, so I just put the little sample methods at the top so you can see them. So convenience, self-selected, systematic, and random. We're going to read the prompt and we're going to decide which method it would be. So that should not be anything that anybody has different. Everybody should have the same method. But then maybe your reason, whether you think it's biased or not, could change. All right, so this one says, computer science teacher wants to know how often students at class or at school access the internet. The teacher asked the students in one of their computer science classes. Which one of those 4 methods would this fall into? Like, how am I collecting this? Yes, this is because it's super easy. We're just asking a class. Convenience. Okay, now, do you think this sampling method in this scenario, do you think this is biased or is this a pretty good way to sample? What do you think? Right? For sure. Okay, you could say these are computer science kids. They're more likely to be on the computer, right? Was anybody else thinking another reason? It's only one class. This is a small sample. I started to write one sample, one class. Now, they don't specify here in the description, but maybe we don't know the grade level, so maybe this could underrepresent certain grade levels depending on which class this would be. But there's a lot of different reasons, and we could all have a little bit different answer here, and I would still count it correct as long as you could defend what you were saying. So just some different options you could put. All right, my second scenario, this says a sports writer wants to determine whether baseball coaches think wooden bats should be mandatory in collegiate baseball. The sports writer mails surveys to all collegiate coaches and uses the surveys that are returned. Which one of those methods would this be? Yes, because they're choosing to respond, right? So this is self-select. Okay, now, do you guys think this is biased, or is this pretty decent way to get our sample going here? What do you think? If you think it's biased, why would it be biased? Jake, what do you think? Right, okay, so maybe, how am I going to write that? People who really care respond. But you could also argue like that could go both ways. You know what I mean? So maybe one coach is really passionate they should require wooden bats, one is really passionate they shouldn't. So maybe they would cancel each other out. So that could maybe eliminate a bias a little bit, but I would take that. Is there any other reason this is bias? I would throw this out there. It says they are going to mail these surveys. So, like, do they have correct addresses for everybody? Is everybody home? Does everybody have a stamp to return the survey? You know what I mean? So maybe email would be a better way to do this or something because you're not having to put a stamp on and send it to the post office. I would question whether that might be biased. Maybe the person's not home to receive it in time. Something like that would be a reason this could be biased. I would say this is not terrible, but I could argue both ways on this one. So like either one, I could argue either one on this. What about this one? This one says a taxi company wants to know whether its customers are satisfied with the service. Drivers survey every 10th customer during the day. What method am I using here? Yes, ma'am, systematic. Every 10th person. Okay, decent, or do we have a bias here that you can think about? I would argue this probably goes to it's probably not, because you're trying to figure out the service that you're providing, and you're using your customers to ask, so that makes sense. The one thing I would maybe say here, this is probably a small sample, because it just says during the day. If they said that we were going to do this for like 2 weeks or a month or something like that, I would maybe argue, if you wanted to say this was biased, that there's a really small sample here. That would be one way. But in general, I think that one's pretty decent. All right. My last scenario, I says a National Collegiate Athletic Association assigns a number to each of its 120 football coaches. Random number generator is used to gather 15 unique numbers, and the coaches associated with these numbers are called and asked about a proposed rule change. What method are we using here to get our sample? This is random. All right, do you think this is biased? Why would it be biased, maybe? Right, but we're not looking at their opinion at the moment. Like why could this be biased? If you think it is. I would probably, on this one, I would probably say, again, this was not biased. If you could figure an argument out, I would read it. But the one thing I would maybe say if I was thinking this was biased, they specifically give you the number of people they're going to randomly call, which would be 15 out of 120. And that's pretty small, but it's not something where I would throw the data out. But if I was going to argue this is biased, that might be what I would bring up. All right, is anybody having a question about the samples? Okay, I'm going to give you the study method. So once you've got your sample, how do you actually get data from these people? So there are 3 study methods. The first one is going to say in an observational study. That's the first one, observational study. What you do, you measure or you just observe your sample in a way that they are not affected by the study. Not affected. All right, so you're just going to literally observe somebody. You don't interact with them. Just write down what they're doing. You don't affect their opinion or whatever activity they're working on. So observational study. The second one, I think you guys will probably have heard of something similar to this at some point in your life, but what they call a controlled experiment. Okay, controlled experiment. What you're going to do, you're going to divide your sample, once you got your sample, into 2 separate groups, and one group gets some kind of treatment, while the other group doesn't get anything, and the group that doesn't get anything, they call that the control group. And then you compare the effect. So I'm going to do something to one of the groups, not do something to the other group, and compare the results. The very last one is called a survey. So it just says in a survey. Literally all you're doing with the survey is you're asking questions, and it could just be, it doesn't have to be a set of questions. You could literally just ask one question. So like that example I had on the front, I said I was going to ask people if they like Pepsi or Coke better. Like it doesn't have to be like a long questionnaire. It could just be one question. Okay, so we're going to keep going with this just a little bit, and then I'm going to stop. All right, now, to create a good survey, we have to use unbiased questions. All right, so if you want a good survey, that was the last option for collecting data. So specifically for survey, you want to make sure if you're going to ask somebody a question that it doesn't have any bias to influence your data. So what I'm going to give you an example to are 3 different scenarios, and we're just going to talk about, like, do we think this is a good question? And if we don't, like, what might be biased about it, and maybe how would we rewrite it? So here's my first question. It says, would you rather watch the latest award-winning movie or just read some book? Do you think that is a good survey question, or would you change that? Okay, what would you change? So what word bothers you? Right? This has got kind of like, as I read that, just some book, like, no big deal. Any other word in there bother you? For sure. That's like, to me, I read that question, I'm going, this person wants me to pick the movie for sure. So to reword this, okay, just get rid of it so it's unbiased. I would literally just write, would you rather watch a movie, nothing biased about that, or read a book? There's no bias. I'm removing kind of some language that might sway the person that's answering one way or the other. All right, my next survey question says, a police officer asked students attending a basketball game, do you wear your seatbelt regularly? Do you think this is biased? Why is it biased? The police officer's asking. Okay, the question itself, I would say the question itself is okay. What the problem is here is the person that's asking. So you have to change who is asking. So maybe you don't have like a uniformed police officer walking up and saying, hey, do you follow the law? You have just, maybe another student or something like that at the basketball game. So the question itself is okay, but the person that's asking it makes it biased because you'd be less likely maybe to be honest there if you don't. All right, and I've got one more. It says, do you think raising taxes to renovate the old town hall would be a mistake? Is this a good way to ask that question? I feel the word mistake is implying you think it's not a good idea, right? Is there anything else you might remove? Jake, what do you think? Yes, that also might be like a little bit biased. All right, so maybe what I would just stay here, should we raise taxes to renovate the town hall? Just trying to remove any like inflammatory language or anything like that.